Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This is a part of the paper on cultural studies that we shall be discussing, and this discussion will be in two modules. The first module, which is on post-colonial theory, will be offering you definitions of some of these terms, which we shall supplement with the e-learning module side by side as we go along. So keep your attention on the e-learning modules also. The first, we shall attempt a definition of post-colonialism. Now, post means later in terms of chronology. Post also means deference, to delay. But this is a very complex term. One cannot have one-to-one definitions of post-colonialism in that way. Therefore, let us now understand what the combination of words comprise. For example, the term colonialism. It must be understood in connection with imperialism. Colonization as a word is derived from the Latin word colonia, which means settled land, farm, landed estate. The root word throws light on the practice of transporting farmers from one place to another for farming, for cultivation purposes. So that is the root word. It actually brings to the fore the conflict between territories, those between the original landowners and the settlers. Migration, the concept of migration, of transportation, could also be understood as settling land by native settlers to keep ties with original land. You know, this kind of connection building connection by transference, but always rooted with a kind of land. This is the concept of colonialism. Now, related to imperialism. Imperialism is understood as a system of military domination of one country over another and trying to establish sovereignty over those territories. Both the terms, colonialism and imperialism, are political and power oriented. But imperialism exercises absolute control and tries to subjugate the people of the territories. There are actually tendencies of exploitation of those territories, which is inbuilt in the concept of imperialism. Imperialism actually means ruling over the people of another territory by a foreign power. Colonialism is defined as a broad concept that refers to the project of European political settlement over non-European areas of territories from the 16th to the 20th centuries, which actually ended with the national liberation of the attainment of freedom of many of these territories in the 20th century. Most of them in the 20th century. This process towards fighting for freedom had gained momentum through the 19th century onwards. Out of this comes another word. It is called neo-colonialism, or reviving some of the aspects of colonialism. Jean-Paul Sartre coined the term neo-colonialism in 1956. It was suggested by Leninism, where new forms of colonialism or domination of the colonizers was discussed. There's another person, Vasily Vajrushev, who defines neo-colonialism as a new hidden colonial policy administered by the imperialist countries over other countries for monetary, political and military gain. This is mainly done by strengthening and reinforcing capitalistic ideologies or using these material properties, material wealth for a particular kind of gain of the colonizers. For those who think that years of colonial rule is over, new colonialism is a fact that one should be alert to. That is why when we began this discussion, we said postcolonialism is a very complex term and it cannot be understood that colonialism has ended, because colonialism finds itself revived in the practices of new colonialism. This brings us to another term, decolonization. Now, according to traditional definitions, decolonization can be understood as a process by which countries legally independent of the colonizers come to be known as sovereign nations. That is, their governance and administration is handled by themselves. They are now free. This would mean that they now possess a constitution of governance, they have their flag and an equal status among other countries in, for example, the United Nations organization. That means they find a place among the other nations of the world. This definition is labeled traditional because the definition is rather narrow and focuses only on the system of political change, a concept of independence. It does not include, for instance, the economic, social and cultural implications of these changes. Decolonization would also mean a conscious denial of all imperial consequences, whether it is political, economic, social, cultural or linguistic. This definition is more acceptable because it is more encompassing, more inclusive, because it includes the colonizer and the colonized in some respect, the colonizer and the colonized in some respects. To explain the idea, there are economic and political and social attitudinal transformations that must be taken into consideration. There is a broad methodology to analyze both the perspective in an equal space. The definition, however, can also give a wrong impression that the history can be reversed, or to be specific, colonial history can be completely erased. We know that history cannot be reversed, though history can repeat itself, nor can colonial history be totally erased, because traces of colonialism persist and sometimes become obvious in different ways. So, decolonization is not the removal of all colonial remnants in the cultures of the colonized countries. It is, in fact, a conscious understanding and awareness of the evolution of cultures. We shall now move towards an attempt to define postcolonialism. Please do not forget, postcolonialism is a very complex term. So it can be broadly summarized as the study of the effects of colonialism on cultures and societies. It is concerned with how European nations conquered and controlled what can be described as third world cultures, and how these groups have since responded to and resisted those encroachments and those of practices of power. Postcolonialism, as a body of theory and a study of political and cultural change, has undergone and continues to undergo three broad stages. So we can understand postcolonialism to manifest a progression through three stages, and these are: number one, an initial awareness of the social, psychological and cultural inferiority that is imposed on the native culture by the imperial power, so that people start feeling inferior to the dominating people. That is the first phase, which means actually colonization of the mind. The mind is colonized to think in terms of its own inferiority. The second phase is a struggle for ethnic, cultural and political autonomy. So this is the spirit of resistance that begins to resist the power of domination, and in all different aspects of societal and cultural practices and behavior. The third phase is a growing consciousness of an overlap and moving towards a stage of hybridity. I would like you to remember this word hybridity, which we shall discuss later. So this cannot be a complete erasure of the colonial regime. Colonialism passes into the post-colonial condition. So there is this kind of continuity that is evident in the term itself, post-colonialism. So colonialism, the traces of it continues into the post-colonial condition. Literally, post-colonial as a term is used to demarcate the period during and after colonization, the process of decolonization. However, a strict historical demarcation is not possible when locating post-colonialism as continuing, in a subtle way into the colonial condition. In literature, in third world literature in particular, is usually identified as post-colonialism, because many of these third world countries had been colonies or dependencies of the European power. When they become free, when they attain nation status, they are called post-colonial, but that means they have moved out of colonial control, but the traces of colonialism continues. This is what we want you to remember, and this is what we shall bring up when we discuss the concept of hybridity later on. The entire field of studying literature and culture of formerly colonized nations is called postcolonial studies, and that is what our module is all about, to understand what postcolonial studies mean. So we have attempted definitions of the words which make up this term. What is colonialism? Understood in contrast with imperialism. What are the factors that go into colonization, the process of colonization? Then how it moves from colonization beyond to a condition of post-colonization, when these countries, these territories find themselves freed from the control and domination of foreign powers. I shall now talk about a very important theorist and his paradigmatic text. The theorist is Edward Said, and his book is Orientalism. Said builds on the premises of another French theorist. He is inspired by the thoughts of this French theorist, whose name is Michel Foucault, especially about the connection between knowledge and power. Said uses a term borrowed from Foucault, and the term is discourse. He uses discourse to develop his idea of what he calls Orientalism, the study of Orient as understood by the non-Orient, by the West, by the Occidental people. Foucault defines the complex term discourse as ways of constituting or containing the thought, the experience of a person, the mental thinking of a person involved in the process of postcolonial awareness, and makes meaning of the subject in discussion. How this subject understands the thought and processes of colonialism and the reflection of itself in the study, in the understanding of colonialism. Foucault's term discourse brings in a sense of history and society and focuses on the shifts of power. The core of Said's Orientalism, Orient and ism, the ideology that creates the sense of Orient, is the study of the shift of power between the colonized and the colonizer. Countries of the East, especially East Asia, is the territory that Said focuses on, and this is often referred to as Oriental in Western studies. In his book Orientalism, Said discusses the common Western misconceptions about the East, which is created in the Western mind. He believes that these misconceptions clearly exist in the Western mind because this is constantly fed into their thought as the images of the East, and creates a kind of a stereotype of the Orient. Edward Said also uses Jacques Lacan's terminology, the other with a capital O, to define the Western fascination of the non-Western. The West is the self, the non-West is the other. So Edward Said discusses his theory of Orientalism, which is the process of creating a misconception, of creating stereotypes in the mind of the non-East, in the mind of the West, about the Orient and its people and its society and its culture. So these misconceptions slowly build up the Western idea of the Orient or the East, which is always understood in terms of stereotypes. To clarify the idea, the identity of oneself, that is the self, the Western self, is defined by contrast with the identities of the other or the non-West. So non-West is understood as the shadow of the self, the other of the self being the Western enlightened concept of knowledge, wisdom, whatever, the whole archive of human behavior, culture, society. For example, an Indian would be understood as an Indian because he is not an inhabitant of the West, like he is not an American or a European. And what are therefore the attributes of an Indian would be understood as very non-Western. Okay? Said means several things by Orientalism. This has become a very powerful word. To him, anyone who teaches, researches, or thinks about the Orient is an Orientalist. And he says, I quote this from Said, Orientalism is a style of thought based upon a distinction made between the Orient and, most of the time, the Occident. Thus, a very large mass of writers, among whom there are poets, novelists, philosophers, political theorists, economists, and imperial administrators, have accepted the basic distinction between East and West as the starting point for elaborate theories, epics, novels, social descriptions, fictive descriptions, and political accounts concerning the Orient, its people, customs, even mind and destiny. So Edward Said talks about how there has been a continuous creation of the non-West as the Orient. Now I shall refer to yet another theorist. His name is Homi Bhabha. Homi Bhabha was instrumental in developing the area of this kind of study without actually mentioning the term postcolonialism. His theories on this area of study are immensely significant. He popularized the term, for instance, ambivalence, mimicry, and hybridity. Now, what are these? What do these mean, these words? Ambivalence is the ambiguous way in which colonizer and colonized regard one another. The colonizer often regards the colonized as both inferior and exotic, okay? While the colonized regards the colonizer as both enviable and also corrupt, evil. So this constitutes this kind of a complicated understanding of each other, which Bhabha tries to explain with the word ambivalence. Now, what is the meaning of the word mimicry? According to Bhabha, mimicry is the way in which the colonized people adapt the culture, language, education, clothing, and very dangerously even the thinking of the colonizers. I use the term colonizing the mind. So this is the insidious way in which the colonized tries to mimic the colonizer. It is not mere imitation. Mimicry is a process by which the adaptation changes the way the cultural context will respond to the colonized, to the practices and the behavior of the colonizer. The receiving culture of the colonized mimics the social, cultural aspects of the colonizer's culture, and that becomes very deep-rooted process in the psyche. Therefore, mimicry paves the way to the third word that we said is very important for us to remember. Homi Bhabha has given us that word. It is hybridity. So what is hybridity? Hybridity is a new culture that is formed from this fusion that is happening between the colonizer's culture and the receiving culture of the colonized. There is a kind of permeation that happens, that many of the practices, behavioral, societal, economic practices, thinking processes permeate into the culture of the colonized. And what is created is a kind of a fusion, a cultural fusion. Homi Bhabha's term for this is hybridity. Let me tell you that all these words are very deep in their connotation. they are not simplistic. So there have been many discussions using these words as the nodal point and discussing how the expression of these, terms happen. What is the manifestation of this, that happens. Take for instance a novel, Daniel Defoe's novel called Robinson Crusoe, that was published in 1719. Crusoe, now post-colonial discourse will argue that Crusoe is the colonizer. He lands up in an island and there he finds a native and he doesn't know his name, so he names the native, and because he was found on a Friday, so the native has no name and he is just given a name by the colonizer as Friday, the day that he was found. Crusoe strives to civilize the native, and by this civilization it means imposing upon the native the tenets and the principles of his own culture. Right? Bhava considers mimicry as the most effective strategy because in Robinson Crusoe you see Friday mimicking the colonizer, Robinson Crusoe. So it is a very powerful way of influencing another mind. Another very important text that has been discussed very often is Shakespeare's play Tempest. Tempest is also the conquest of an island. Most likely this was the time when Caribbean islands were being colonized by the Western powers, and Prospero, who has left his own kingdom, finds an island and he fights the inhabitant there, supposed to be a queen, and she is referred to as a witch, and he colonizes her son Caliban. A very interesting story how Caliban learns the language of his master but learns to curse him, and the process of colonization is shown by Shakespeare as a very in a very powerful way to show the adverse side of colonization also. So there is the kind of ambivalence in this relationship of the colonizer and the colonized, as we see in the story of Friday, as we see in the story of Caliban. This ambivalence in the relationship is very evident through the process of mimicry, and as the fusion of the culture happens as hybridity. For example, we do not know if Friday is afraid of Robinson Crusoe, if Caliban is definitely unhappy with the master, but there is also this kind of relationship that persists. So these are some texts that we remember. There are so many others because post-colonialism has given us a method, a new method of understanding texts from a different perspective, from the colonizers' texts understood and read now by the colonized. Very interestingly, Robinson Crusoe has been rewritten from the colonized perspective by a South African writer of great repute, Coetzee, and his novel Foe takes off from Daniel Defoe, and he has recreated the story of Robinson Crusoe in a new way. Very interesting reading in contrast. To go back to our discussion of postcolonialism, in defining this term, another post-colonial theorist of repute, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, focuses attention on the continuing consequences and the power of colonial discourses, practices and mindsets which persist, which continue in the present. Spivak argues, for example, she focuses on women, and she argues that the lives of women in the third world countries cannot simply be expressed or represented using vocabularies of Western critical theory or even the vocabulary of male writers in post-colonial arena. One has to understand a different discourse to understand the plight of the women in post-colonial societies. To Spivak, this is an ethical and a political issue of the oppressed groups. The women continue to be more oppressed than the men because of the patriarchy, prevailing patriarchy. So this is quite another discourse that would be required to understand the condition of the women in post-colonial societies, and would need new kind of vocabulary which would be, according to Spivak, at once ethical and political. She believes that in such a case, women or any other minority group will be silenced. Otherwise, to make them articulate, they would have to be given the freedom to express or articulate themselves in a different kind of a discourse. She upholds Said's idea of marginality and discusses the inability of women to express or speak for themselves, even minorities to speak for themselves. You will know that there is a very important essay, paradigmatic essay that Spivak has written. The title is, Can the Subaltern Speak? What is the language of the subaltern? Is it the language of imposition, or is it the articulation that comes from within them? So the word subaltern, that has also become very popular in post-colonial discussions, is actually taken from a very powerful thinker and writer called Antonio Gramsci. This word subaltern is used to refer to a group that exists outside power structures, the established power structures. It is a reference to those groups which are disfranchised and disempowered. So Spivak raises the question, can the subaltern speak? So they would need a new kind of a vocabulary to be able to speak about their oppression, their subjugation. Please remember that these groups exist within post-colonial societies. And therefore we talked about new colonialism earlier. The problem that Spivak points out is that the knowledge is nothing but a commodity that is created and is constantly modified by the West and transferred to the rest of the world for their own benefits. In fact, Spivak proposes the research is always colonial because it otherizes, new word, otherizes and objectifies the subject. Spivak brings up the example of the practice of sati and argues that in this case, women were merely the subjects of, control by men. It is primarily this gender disparity that restricted women to articulate their oppression. So Spivak talks about these various kinds of silences that exist even now in post-colonial studies. These silences are usually the areas of the minorities, women being a minority themselves. So the post-colonialism has therefore a significance in dealing with various issues which bring to the fore the connection between power and people. And power is a very intense kind of an experience, and power, as Foucault says, circulates in a particular society and takes into control many different subjects. Among them, the post-colonial understanding of subjectivity, of identity, of nation and nationhood, and different other can be extended to different other subjects. For example, diaspora and cosmopolitanism. These we shall discuss, the idea of diaspora and cosmopolitanism, we shall discuss in the next module. Let us now summarize what we have done so far. We began by identifying our focus today, and that was to understand what is postcolonial studies. Now, postcolonial studies, we went into the different terms that make up postcolonialism to understand what are the implications of the term. We discussed colonialism and what comes later in relationship with imperialism. We discussed neocolonialism to emphasize that once a country becomes free of domination of another country, it can be called post-colonial only to a certain extent, because the influence of colonialism continues as traces in the post-colonial condition. And most insidious of this is colonization of the mind. The foreign power may have left after exploitation of the territories, but what remains are many of the practices of the colonizer which has been mimicked, which has been imitated by the colonized and continues to prevail. This is very dangerous. We also discussed the concept of Orientalism as proposed by Edward Said. Inspired by Foucault's thinking, he has discussed the othering of the non-Western cultures, which produces certain kind of stereotypical understanding of the non-West in the Western mind, and which continues. We discussed two other terms that Homi Bhabha has proposed. Besides mimicry, he has proposed the concept of ambivalence to explain the relationship between the colonized and the colonizer. And he has also given us a very interesting word, hybridity, which we shall discuss in the next module also. We also discussed Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, a very powerful post-colonial theorist who has brought in the concept of the discourse of the minorities. Her focus is on women of non-Western societies and cultures who are doubly oppressed, because not only by colonialism but also by patriarchy. They're doubly colonized. There are other minority groups also in similar situation, which she refers to as subaltern. The subaltern, disempowered and disfranchised people. And she talks about the new kind of articulation, new kind of vocabulary that would be required for them to express their experience of oppression and subjugation. This is otherwise, post-colonial studies will retain silences, gaps, disruptions in our understanding of the condition of post-colonial societies and its people, their culture and behavior. and their mindset. Thank you.